Hey everyone, welcome to another webinar. Today we're going to be talking about budgeting for nonprofits, but not in the way that you normally think about budgeting. Today we're going to be talking about budgeting in a way that's more inclusive of the team members that you want involved in the financial management. I'm going to share a PowerPoint presentation or, like I normally do and provide some visuals with the conversation that we're going to be having here. But before we do that, I want to just dive into some housekeeping items real quick. This will be recorded and available on our website. If you go to the charitycfo.com, under the resource tab, you will see this webinar along with all of our other webinars there underneath that section. So if you're only able to plug in for a period of time, know that that is available. If you have any questions, go ahead and drop them in the Q&A. That would be super helpful. And we will get to those throughout the presentation, and I will stop if it makes sense based on that topic. I have a team member, Kim, that's hiding behind the scenes, and she will be helping me moderate the chat and the Q&A there. So thank you for that, Kim. And let's see. We are, I guess, go ahead and start. We'll go ahead and start the conversation about budgeting and how to get more people accountable. I don't think there's any other housekeeping items. With that, chat, Q&A, and yeah, let's go ahead and get started. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. We'll do that. And we'll dive right into the conversation. So like I said, this is not your normal budgeting conversation on how to budget. The conversation is really around accountability. I say this a lot within our firm, and the reality is so many nonprofit leaders reach out. I think I made a post the other day, over 700 nonprofit leaders we've already talked to this year. And I would say at the top of the list of the frequently frustrating points, frequently cited frustrating points that nonprofit leaders often cite is something around budgeting and wishing that more people were included in the budget process. Not just in the creation of the budget, but the management of the budget and how do we spend, how do we keep our teams accountable for the grants that we have to manage, the balances on those grants, the spend down. Anything along those lines is something that is frequently cited as a point of frustration and something that nonprofit leaders wish that they had just a better system for. And the reality is a lot of that is structured around kind of culture of the organization and also around the tools that make it easier for nonprofit leaders to share the financial makeup of their particular departments and how to keep them accountable. So we're going to be talking about that, not just on like, why is it good? Because I think we all kind of know why it's good to include more and more people in the budgeting process, but practical steps on how to start shifting your organization from a very budget siloed approach to a more collaborative, inclusive approach. So that's what we're going to be talking about here. And a fun little story, as many of you all know, I used to be a CFO of a nonprofit. I only worked with one nonprofit. And it was really interesting when I started working with this organization, nobody other than the CFO and the CEO participated in the budget process. And it was kind of fascinating to me. And nobody knew, the program directors, the fundraising team, nobody knew their expenses, and they didn't really even know their revenue, frankly. Well, the fundraising team knew what the revenue goals were. But the program team had no visibility on how many grants actually funded their particular programs. And if they were restricted grants, like how many dollars were we actually able to spend on things, for example, like summer camp and the supplies for summer camp? And are we on track to spend those dollars down during that grant period? So it's really interesting when I started working with this organization because every single person came to me for every single expense that they wanted to pay for, whether it's like supplies or professional development or whether they can hire another person, whatever it might be. Every single financial decision came through and was kind of approved by the CFO. And it was really difficult because it's a lot of requests, frankly. And I really had this idea, how do we get the program team to really define, specifically the programs, because we had multiple programs, how do we get the program team to define what they need to execute on their goals for the year? What initiatives do they have? What events do they have? What expansion of their program do they have? All of these sorts of things. And how do they start mapping out what resources they need in order to make that a success, right? And if we were able to put that in a way that the program directors or the fundraising team or the various different departments, if they were able to get a report on how they were actually doing and they participated in the budget process, and they knew that they put in the budget that two of their team members were going to go to a professional development conference for $250, they don't have to ask me for every single expense. Now, of course, the CFO and the CEO would work. And we would be able to, hey, if for some reason there was some catastrophic funding issue or a cash flow problem or something like that, we reserve the right to say, everybody park it on the spending for a minute until we recalibrate here. But that, thankfully, we were never really in that situation. But this is really about empowerment of the team and to kind of diffuse the responsibility, as we often call it here at the Charity CFO. So that's really what we're talking about. That's what inspired me, frankly, to start this firm, the Charity CFO. It really inspired me to advocate for this more collaborative um, just budget process and the diffusion of responsibilities, as we call it, for those that share in the financial management of the organization. I would argue everybody in a leadership position within your organization has responsibility for the financial management. In the same way that if you talk to any professional fundraisers out there, they would say that every single person in the organization has responsibility to fundraise. I would say the same is true for the financial management of the organization. And so now that you heard my TED Talk, let's dive into more of the nuts and bolts of what we're talking about here. So why this conversation matters now. As I mentioned to you, I talk with hundreds of nonprofit leaders every single year, and at the very top of the list is the frustration around every single decision, good or bad, about the financial management sits on the shoulders of the CEO and or the CFO if an organization has that. And it's really challenging because as an organization grows, it becomes harder and harder and harder for one person to really know all of the things that all of these departments need. So mid-sized nonprofits are outgrowing their budget process before they even realize it. We're going from a small organization where one person could do it kind of on the back of an envelope to something that now we need to really be tracking by different funding sources or grants, right? Maybe we also need to be tracking it by different departments or functions now that we've outgrown our baby 990, and we have more of an exhaustive 990 or an audit, something to that nature. I think especially in this world that we live in where funding priorities seem to be changing all the time, or quite frankly, we're in a season of a lot of uncertainty around funding and volatility, right? Whether it's, the stock market and portfolios are being impacted, or now the federal government and their freezes or their changes in strategies on how they fund different programs. The philanthropic community is kind of swinging the pendulum to accommodate some of those wild and volatile changes that's happening in our space. So there's a lot of things happening that causes us to be very reactive in nature anyway. And budgeting, without having an effective budget or without having some sort of co-ownership of that financial management, it becomes really difficult to communicate all of that change within our team. It's difficult to articulate why keeping tabs on the money that's predictable and coming in or the expenses going out. We definitely have to spend these, right, in accordance with our grant, or we have to be really diligent about exhausting these contracts for a variety of reasons, or just as an organization, we're in a cash crunch, right? Because of maybe some of our funding is frozen if we get federal funds right now, for example. So budgeting as a whole can be very reactive or political, not necessarily by our choice, sometimes by our environment, but oftentimes I see this by kind of default for organizations. Budgeting could be short-sighted because maybe there was expansion in a program and that wasn't really communicated to the CFO and they didn't bake in the right assumptions there. It can be really political if we're not having or a source of division within an organization. I've personally sat in conversations, well, why does this program get these resources and we don't get these resources, and really kind of break down the nature of restricted grants and where we have funding for initiatives and where we don't, unfortunately, and how do we as a leadership team kind of come together and understand the resources that are available and why they're available. And it's not favoritism. It is grants and the grant budget and how the grants were awarded, right? And then, of course, it's not just great from an internal perspective, but stronger budgets create a better strategy, better decision making, and ultimately stronger funder trust. So if you have a robust budgeting process, you keep your finger on the pulse with where you're at on those restricted grants, for example, or utilization of contracts, if they're program service revenues, things like that, it definitely builds much more trust with your funders, but also I would argue your board, maybe your staff, or any other stakeholders that are paying attention. Maybe I don't have to tell you all this, but I think budgeting and participating more people in understanding what are the inner workings of an organization is is just as important as it's ever been, if not arguably more. So these are some of the learning objectives that I hope you all are able to walk away from. One of the things is really just kind of reframing the understanding and the purpose of budgeting, and not just a necessary compliance tool or something in your bylaws that requires you to do it, even though it's an outdated, archaic process. You don't pay attention to it, or you don't share it with anybody, which, by the way, that happens all the time. So if you're one of them, you're not alone. How to engage, like actual tools and actual processes that we use with our clients to shift from that siloed approach to the collaborative approach. Red flags to look for if you are struggling in your budgeting process, and some real life examples on how to overcome that. And some smarter processes to build strategy and accountability, because it's not just one thing to create a budget that's collaborative, but how do you have accountability on the other side of that, so that the team doesn't just involve themselves in the initial creation of the budget, but they're actually reviewing those reports and they're managing, they're asking good questions, right? And then I want to share a little bit more about this diffusion of responsibilities that we talk about in the Charity CFO Financial Blueprint. And this is a set of principles that we've seen the commonalities among all of the organizations we work with. The most successful organizations we have what we've put together a 30-point list of best practices that we find for our most successful clients that we'll share with that a little bit later on. Okay, so let's just dive into what really a budget is and what it isn't. I think a budget is not just a forecast, but it's a tool for leadership. And what is a forecast? Let's break it down. And I apologize if I'm getting too basic for some people, but a budget versus a forecast, let's talk about the difference. A budget is the plan. We put the plan together. Usually, let's pretend we're a December year end now. Sometime around this time of year, we're going to start, brushing off the template from last year. We're going to, start having conversations about what are we going to do next year. We're going to put the plans together. We're going to put the numbers into the spreadsheet, and we're going to come up with a total number of revenue, total number of expenses. Hopefully it's at least a balanced budget. We send that off to the board, they approve it, and all is well. Except by the time that they usually approve it, let's say it's sometime in December, if we're lucky, before the holiday season, and everyone kind of goes off on their own on their own paths, we get that approved. But we know also in December we get a bunch of grant awards or contract expansions or not, right? Some of the assumptions that we thought were going to be true in that budget that was just approved is now null and void. Right? So the budget is now moderately useful, but we know it's already outdated. And so that's kind of the budget. It's a good plan. It's a good start. It's an outline of our assumptions in a way that's measurable in some sort of dollar amount. A forecast is really kind of taking that budget originally, and now it's starting to incorporate what's actually happening within the organization. So you kind of supersede whatever you thought was going to happen in January for your budget. You now override that with the things that are actually happening now. So populate everything happening in January, February, March, so on and so forth. And also the months that haven't happened yet, what are those changes or in those assumptions that you thought was going to be true that you now are not going to be true, right? So that's what a forecast is. And so a budget can be a forecast, and I encourage you to consider it a forecast. Shameless plug, that's going to be the discussion for next week's or next month's webinar. But is not just a forecast, but it's really a tool. It's intended to be a roadmap for us to think about what do we want for our programs? How are we going to expand it? How are we going to reinvest? How are we going to enrich them in certain ways? How are we going to expand our reach for fundraising? What are those initiatives going to look like? And anything else within your organization, capacity building on the administrative team, really aligning what's happening in the strategic plan. If you have a plan, if you don't have a plan, you're at least setting some sort of goals, initiatives, or tackling those things that you know you want to be true for your organization. And you're creating a roadmap for that. And you're putting dollars to those objectives, and you're putting it in such a way that aligns with kind of your mission and your objectives, hopefully your strategic plan or any other goals that you have for your organization. It's a decision-making tool. So no longer do the days have to be CFO. Can I spend $300 on program supplies? If that was in your plan, if that was in your budget, then absolutely you can, as long as there's not something else catastrophic within the organization, it really empowers the leader of that department or that program or whatever it might be to actually spend the dollars that we've already allocated to their department. It's a communication tool. So again, communicating what are the expectations for both revenue generation by different functions of your business, expenses that you've already mapped out, and then a feedback loop on this is what we budgeted and why, because we've gone through that exercise, and this is actually what happened. And it really prompts the conversation to see how are things really going. And then ultimately, a budget is a benchmark based on the assumptions that we had. Now, as I mentioned before, those benchmarks often change because the assumptions change. Take a quick drink of water here. Okay. So that's what a budget is, and that's what a budget maybe isn't, according to, my experience working with lots and lots of budgets. Let's talk about what's broken in budgets. I know that budgets are um, not a one size fits all. Budgets can be really confusing and complicated for people. And organizations come to us all the time with the struggle on figuring out why is their budget process such a pain point for their team. And these are some of the common issues that I see with budgeting or the process itself. Number one, we've talked about this already a little bit. It's created by one person in a silo, right? It's being it's being done by the CFO or the CEO, and nobody else has visibility to it. It's nobody knows what's going on. They're not really accountable to it. They don't feel empowered. It's hard to hold their team accountable to it. This is a really difficult situation to find as a program director or a development director. How can I be empowered to run my department if I don't even have a basic understanding of what my budget is or how I'm performing with my budget? Oftentimes, performance is not really tied to the financial health of that particular department. Um, it's in a silo. Um, no connection to real goals or strategies. I've talked about that before. So often I've seen organizations have a strategic plan. We're going to do this and this and this and all these amazing ideas. Or, over the next 10 years, we're going to, triple in size or even more. I've seen certainly more aggressive growth in that, but we're really not attaching dollars to those initiatives or those projects. And sometimes it might also be tied to capital improvements. So we need to make investments in technology, or we need to expand our, office footprint. If that's the case, we want to add another regional office in some other cities. So taking into consideration lease expansions and things like that. Like, does your budget in their current year, or if you have a multi-year budget, really take into consideration those goals or strategic decisions that your organization has made? Like I said, hopefully you have a strategic plan, or at least beyond a 12-month timeline that you're kind of thinking about the what's next within your organization. But are we really taking into consideration the dollars that are going to be associated with that? Budget versus actuals are never reviewed. So budgets are kind of put together as a plan. At least we know we have the resources coming in for the expenses that we know we're likely going to incur, but they're not necessarily reviewed on a consistent basis. Now, all of our reports that we provide for all of our clients have a budget versus actual report, right? So all of our clients are reviewing that on a monthly basis. I know that many organizations are not reviewing that in a regular basis, and sometimes that could be the way you put your budget together on a spreadsheet doesn't align with your accounting system. I see this way more often than you might think. How an organization kind of thinks about themselves internally by department or function. Maybe they think about it by location. They think about revenue in a different way that's defined in the accounting system. It's almost like the accounting system was set up at some point in time, but the organization has evolved beyond that, but their accounting system hasn't evolved. So as a result, it's really hard to kind of put the comparison of the actuals and the budget together because they're not formatted in the same way. I see this a lot. So that could be a barrier, or sometimes they're not reviewed by the appropriate people. Maybe it goes to the CEO in a monthly report, and look, that CEO is pulled in a million different directions. They're not reviewing it with a fine-tooth comb. They're not asking necessarily all the questions. But I would like to see where budget versus actuals are also shared with other key leaders within the organization, especially if they have a pretty significant area of responsibility. So think about if you have specific programs or grants that need to be managed and you have a budget to that, how do we share with those individuals that how they're actually doing and give them the detail that backs up how they're doing so that they can review those expenses or that revenue and say, hey, that doesn't actually belong in my program. I don't know what that is. What's going on here? We'll talk a little bit more about incorporating other individuals and how to build some accountability there. But budgets too, I mean, for all of us that have been around the nonprofit space for a long time, budgets are often used for grants, right? We often have to make all kinds of variations of our budget for different grant applications. And we do that because it's necessary for grant writing. We put together an organizational budget, but we're not really using that organizational budget for as an operating tool, or the budget that we write for our grants aren't always. That maybe assumes growth, that maybe assumes some sort of expansion in some way, but it's not actually kind of a tool that we're using day in and day out. So those are some of the things that I've seen are really what's broken in most budgets that I've observed with the clients that have come to work with us, and some of the transformation we've made on that front. Okay, let's hop on over to, I shared with you a little bit about this blueprint that I was telling you about. This is that 30-point step of all of the things that we've observed that really work for well-run organizations. This is really what sets them apart. And number 12, in no particular order, but it's definitely high up on there. Budgeting is the number 12 principle on our blueprint. And budgeting, we believe, is the first step in building a sustainable financial infrastructure. So on this blueprint, which I'll give you all a link to that, or you can actually find it on our resource tab under our website. You can download it there for free. But you cannot build a good financial management plan or infrastructure or function, I think, without a budget, with some sort of benchmark, without some sort of understanding. Now, again, I like to take that budget and not just set it up on a shelf. I like to convert it into a forecast and really evaluate, all right, now that a month or 2 or 3 months have gone by, where are we at now? What direction are we heading? Are we on or off track with what we thought? And to be able to make important decisions that way. And I would also argue that not just creating an annual budget is important, but sharing them with different department owners, having it mission aligned and reviewing it on a regular basis is super critical. So let's talk about that a little bit more. Let's talk about budgeting as a team sport and why this is so important. I wholeheartedly believe that we should be looking at budgets by department or function or class if you're a QuickBooks user, and you should be building a budget how you operate your organization. And your accounting system should be structured in a way on how you think about your organization. So if you are an organization that you don't have an accounting system that tracks different functions of the business and everything just goes into one column, you need to be thinking about, how do you think about your organization? Do you feel like you have two different programs? You have two different program leaders, you have a director of development, you have somebody that kind of runs the administrative side of your organization. Then you need to be thinking about, you almost have 4 different budgets that kind of consolidate all up into one, right? So this budgeting process, we're going to be talking about this team sport approach, is including those program leads, development, HR, people that involve themselves in operations. These are going to be the people that know the expenses attributed to their work. For example, your operations person is going to know the software renewals and how much costs are going to be tied up in, the purchase of new equipment next year. They're probably going to understand the increases in your rent per your lease agreement or something to that effect. Your HR director might know what those benefit renewals are coming in at. They're going to understand the participation rate in your 401k and how that's been going up. So we should budget more for it, right? Your development team might understand that, hey, we've been doing this event, but unless we change this event, the cost of our venue or cost of doing that event is going to be more expensive. So we need to budget for more event expenses, for example. A program lead might know that, hey, we've had a tremendous turnout for that camp, and we're going to anticipate doubling the size of that camp and bringing in more kids. So we need to plan for more supplies. So these are the sort of granular level questions that, frankly, your CFO alone is probably not necessarily going to have. Or even if they do have, they just try to take maybe industry averages or based on surveys from peer groups that they're part of, or that your organization might be part of. They try to pull all this information and get their best guess. But really, by engaging all these people and having a collaborative effort, we're going to be able to get better data, better insights, to put some real dollars there. And then ultimately, as I kind of mentioned, a bit of my friction and my frustration moving into a nonprofit that had a very siloed approach. it is really, really important to drive ownership of these different budgets and reduce the friction between the different people, because I was like the policy police, the the rule maker, the approver on all things, and that does kind of put your leadership team in this weird kind of um boundary dynamic that's just not very useful and effective, and I see this time and time again. All right, so let's step into it. Let's talk about what the process would look like then. All right, Tasha, you've convinced me. All right, we all these things sound good. That's why we're here. We subscribe to your theories and your narrative, whatever. Let's talk about what that actually looks like in a practical sense. And this is the exact same approach that we take with all of our clients. So I'm kind of sharing that with you all here. First thing we're gonna dive into these a little bit more detail, but kind of on a step by step, I always start with revenue. I look at historical information, like what have we been doing um, in the past year, and I look at pipelines. So that could be by grants. And when I talk about grants, think about like foundation grants, philanthropic grants. I'm talking about contracts. Are they expiring? Are they expanding? What's happening with contracts? I also look at fundraising revenue. What is the pipeline for growth there in terms of like major giving or event revenue or anything of that nature? I'm also talking about any other expansion on the program side. If we do any sort of earned revenue, if we're a school and we have tuition or something to that degree. So we're looking at historical information and assumptions for or pipeline for new growth. Expense, same, looking at a model with fixed costs, things that we know, things that are going to happen regardless, and also variable costs. So what are those variable costs that are going to be going up as we add program participants, employees, whatever it might be? We have to take into consideration that there's a variable cost component for those sort of things. Variable cost component largely is driven by personnel and anything tied to people, right? As our organization grows, so does the people costs, especially. Most of our clients usually sit somewhere between 60 and 80% of their budget are tied to people. We're talking salaries, benefits, insurance related to that, taxes, all those sorts of things. All the fringes are a pretty considerable part of any budget. Okay, so then again, looking at revenues, looking at expenses, but also making sure that especially program budgets align to strategic goals. Again, making sure that if we're looking at, when I talk about strategic goals, I'm not just talking about the strategic plan, although that's important, but I'm also talking about if we know as an organization that we have a signed contract for the expansion of new programming in a new region or just in the existing region, whatever, we're going to be taking a look at every single one of those grant budgets for any approved revenues that have come in and making sure that we're including those dollars in our organizational budget because we've committed to spending that. And especially if that's something that hasn't historically been done, we want to make sure that any new changes to the organization is going to be incorporated there. And then, of course, there's the more traditional strategic goals that if we're going to be doing new initiatives, for example, this was such a well-received event by our program participants, we're going to do this twice this year. Okay, let's make sure that the cost is now ×2 for that particular initiative rather than just rolling forward whatever we did last year. One of the things that we do is I mentioned kind of think about your organization a bit as like a matrix, right? We've got the revenues and expenses on one side of the financial, like this Excel spreadsheet, whatever it is you're working on. And then you have different columns for all the different departments within your organization. And think about how you look at your organization and how that's divided up. Maybe again, you have like an administrative person or at least a department, even if it's not necessarily tied to one person. Some people wear many hats, right? So you have an administrative function, probably have a fundraising function of some sort, and you probably have one or multiple programmatic functions. Within some of those, you might have subsets. So you might have an IT as part of your admin, for example. You might have HR or recruiting or volunteer management could be really big for one of you all here on the webinar. So really kind of thinking about who those budget leads should be based on their function. And what we do is we create templates for every single one of our departments for each one of our client, and then we assign that to a particular person. That person is then going to be pouring through the historical information, the strategic goals of the organization, and other known changes for the future. And they're going to be working to populate each one of those sections. And then what we do, of course, is we review many, many times in stages and iterations. And so we're going to be looking at those different department lead budgets individually and just making sure we're not missing things and really getting an understanding of like, why are we putting these dollars in here? Why is that important? And then we're going to pull it all together in a consolidated way. And that's when the fun begins. Not really, it's never fun. And by the way, it's always bad news. It's always like, oh, we have this huge deficit in our budget. And that's where we have to go back to the drawing board and make some of the executive decisions to cut expenses in various areas to get a more balanced budget for our clients. Okay, so that is kind of in a nutshell our approach to it, and then ultimately take it to the board and approve it. But let's take let's take a look at some of the blind spots, some of the missed items, the things that need more scrutiny on the revenue side or the expense side. So what I often see as the big significant permanent variances that show up in a budget that we have to address every single month in our board report, it's usually tied to these things on the revenue side. We'll talk about the expense side here in a little bit. But on the revenue side, we're talking about overly optimistic grant projections, right? Whether it's we have a grant writer and we have to go out and seek new grants, for example, and we're really overly optimistic about what we think we're going to get for grants, and we end up not getting as many grants. Or alternatively, if you all are thinking about grants or contracts that are more of a fee for service, we're overly optimistic about our capacity to deliver on those services, and then we fall short on the units, for example, that we were able to bill for. Another area that I see oftentimes on the revenue side, we'll call it timing differences. I would also call it maybe accounting differences between finance and fundraising. For example, I just had an organization we recently started working with that had budgeted in 2025, their fiscal year, June 30th, so their fiscal year is only a couple months in. They had budgeted for revenue to come in 2026, this year that we're in now, but the grant award was given last fiscal year, so back I think in like May or June. Well, the accounting team, per generally accepted accounting principles, recorded the revenue in 2025 and booked it as a receivable. But the finance team looks at things on a cash basis, money in the door, right? And so they actually budgeted this $50,000 to come in fiscal year 26, but the accounting team had already counted it for 25. And y'all don't have to be accountants on here to know you can't count it twice. So if it's already in 2025, you can't count it for 2026. So those timing differences and really being in sync with both finance and fundraising and making sure that we understand how we account for those things, and when we define our fundraising goals and where we're at with that budget, how do we define that? And I could go a whole webinar about that, and I actually have in different versions of this conversation, is really getting in sync with what is a fundraising goal? Let's define that and be really, really clear. 'Cause sometimes it's just a number, but it's a lot of confusion about, is that cash in the door? Does that include pledges? If it was recorded as a pledge last year, but it's cash in the door this year, I shouldn't count it, right? And so making sure that your development team fully understands how the finance team is accounting for that, so that whenever we do that budget to actual report, we're not going to show a big out of sync kind of disconnect or variance there. Reliance on unrestricted donations. So this is something that we hope that more unrestricted donations come in the door, but the reality is some of them come in with restrictions, so we can't necessarily spend them on all of the things, or we just assume maybe individual donations are going to be stronger than what we really thought. Sometimes those unrestricted donations can come from known sources, unknown sources. Sometimes we're too optimistic on the go get, as we call it, those unidentified donors. So kind of an over reliance on that front, and the lack of multi-year planning ultimately. So again, kind of going back to some of the timing differences and when the money comes in, when the money is spent, but also not recognizing that if the contract is slated to end, for example, mid-year, which happens a lot for our clients, right? The grant period is different than our fiscal year, then we will maybe run out of money, or we don't know if that grant is going to be renewed mid-year. And yet we have expenses, especially if it's tied to people. As I already mentioned, most of a nonprofit's budget is related to people. What impact does that have if that grant is not renewed? And when it's not renewed, what's the trickle effect from that? Like what's the impact there? Do we keep the team member? Do we not? Do we continue the program despite the lack of funding? Those are all really difficult decisions to make there. So on the expense side of things, these are some of the areas that are often missed on the expense side of things. Hidden staffing costs. Sometimes it could be timing of raises. We budget that all for the assumption it goes in at the beginning of the year, when in reality it's rolled out on an anniversary date basis, for example. So that can be in our favor. Costs associated with having to hire new folks if we don't really think thoughtfully about what our staffing plan looks like, or if we're just using a budget historical information like, oh, payroll was X amount of dollars last year. We're just going to assume that dollar amount and add 5% to it, or some known cost of living adjustment or just some sort of escalation rate, then we're probably being a little short-sighted on what staffing needs we actually have, especially if we're not taking into consideration any vacancies or openings in the staff throughout the year. And that could also be like, for example, consider if you hired a team member midway through the year last year, then we need to assume a full year of compensation costs associated with that team member for the next coming year. Staffing costs, especially related to benefits, fringe, maybe they're not so hidden, but just unfortunate nonetheless. Many of us are getting our health insurance renewals right now, and those are coming in much higher than what we would like. And so those are some costs that creep up on us and have a pretty big impact, especially if you're budgeting for, a 5 or a 10% increase in medical premiums, and it shoots up to something like 20%, something to that effect. I have another organization I work with that started doing a better job marketing their 401k and the benefits there. And they had a surge in participation on that 401k, but the budget was based on what we've historically spent. So of course, that's going to be a permanent budget variance for us all year, something we need to take into consideration. Anything else related to like workers' comp? Sometimes workers' comp rates are adjusted annually after an audit, but that's an unexpected cost that can come up if you grow your program or if you grow your organization and bring on a bunch of new staff. You will have to true up those costs typically come workers' comp audit time, which, like I said, usually happens once a year. Tech subscriptions that renew unnoticed. These are things that get missed, especially if we're not paying attention to it. A lot of us are now kind of forced to pay on an annual basis and renew those subscriptions. And tech renewals are going, talk about health insurance increase going through the roof. The tech costs are incredible and not in a good way. So kind of keep an eye on that. No separation of fixed versus variable costs. So again, if you're just assuming that everything is going to go up, 3% every year, but if you're planning on doubling the staff size, then we need to take into consideration variable cost and increase those proportionate with the growth in our program or our staff or whatever it might be. And this is the thing that I think most people miss. Oftentimes would be no consideration for what I call non-expense cash outflows. So think about debt repayments, capital investments like purchase of equipment, buildings, furniture, things like that. If you have any sort of cash outflow, in these ways, they don't show up on your expense, on your P&L, profit and loss statement, statement of activities. And oftentimes as a result, they don't show up in your budget. And so how do you make sure that you're including not just the expenses that you need to pay for operations, but also additional cash that you need to make good on whatever commitments that you've made, whether it's debt, capital investments, et cetera. All right. Skipping ahead because I do want to leave some time for questions at the end. Let's talk about grant budgets versus internal budgets. Grant budgets are tools for funders, not for leadership. So it's totally okay to create grant budgets that are unique for funders, but definitely not for leadership. Be really thoughtful about what the budget looks like for your organization. Make sure it's in alignment with your accounting system, makes it much easier to track. And we're going to get into some of the technology that we use to be able to get the accounting system in sync with the end users, people that are spending the dollars, and how that information flows back into the accounting system. So we want to make sure that everything is synced up really nicely, that your organizational budget aligns with your accounting system. Your accounting system is then synced up with some tools that we're going to be sharing here in just a little bit. Okay, so if you're questioning if your budget is a little on the broken side, take these things into consideration. Or if you're wondering if you need to just do a better process or develop a better process for it, Budget never matches reality. So if every year we have wild swings, and it never matches reality, or shortly thereafter it doesn't match reality. If you have an approach of just like increase everything by a certain percentage, which admittedly a lot of smaller organizations do that, then it's probably time for a better process. If no one remembers how the numbers were set, no one remembers what these numbers are or why in their particular program or department, they have no idea where these numbers came from, or maybe they helped participate in it, but they didn't document their assumptions, then the process is probably broken. If department heads are surprised by their targets, I'm mostly looking at the fundraising folks in the room where they get a number that's provided to them, which basically serves as a financial plug. Like, here are all our expenses. By the way, in order to cover that, we need you to go fundraise X amount of dollars, which happens all the time. Good luck with that. And fundraisers are like, what? That's not even achievable, right? If they're surprised by it, it's probably because we've not given them the opportunity to map through on the revenue side. What is the historical giving? What's the pipeline for new givers? What's actually reasonable? And can we reconcile that somehow with the expenses? Perhaps the board gets financials, but not necessarily insights. So maybe they just get the actual numbers on the paper with the dollar signs, like truly the financial reports, but they're not getting any insights. With all of our clients, we like to give a narrative with the numbers to help discuss, like, why are there key variances? Like, what are the permanent versus temporary timing differences with your budget? And then last but not least, the leadership does not understand where they're at with their department budgets. And I would even take another step down below that, like grant budgets. I talk with so many different people in the the fundraising side or the program side that really, really want to understand where they're at from a grant management standpoint or just their overall department budget. I think sometimes we feel like, well, numbers are not, their background, or they're overwhelmed by it, but there's very few people that I talk to that are not encouraged or excited about participating in the budget process, or at least knowing where they're at from that standpoint. And I think more importantly too, on the grant side, we don't want to leave money on the table. And so if they know that they need to spend X amount of dollars, they want to have kind of a prompting to do that, or at least a means to track whatever that looks like. Okay, so if you were to go out and do the next few things, what would I recommend? The first thing, rebuild the process with the contributors. So going back to the root of it, how do we identify who needs to be involved in the process? How do we, engage them in that way? How do we build templates that help them put together their assumptions? How do we create reports that provide them with historical information to do it? And just really start rebuilding the process. It's not going to be perfect straight away. I'm going to be honest with you. It usually takes us a couple years with our clients because we only do it once a year, right? So it takes a couple years to get the rhythm down for people to start to feel a little bit more comfortable. And believe me, they will be stressed, they will be overwhelmed, they will be anxious, but with some mentorship and some guidance, people usually are actually pretty encouraged by it. So that's process number one. We get them involved in the process. Let's assume between steps 1 and 2, the budget gets finalized. Then the next step in the process is staff participate in the categorization of expenses. And I put consider technology, not technology expenses, but I mean actually software that allows them to make it easier to categorize the expenses. And I'm going to talk about the tech stack that we use here shortly. But you've got to get staff, like, they created the budget, they created the assumptions. Okay, now I use my corporate credit card to go out and spend dollars. I know where those dollars are supposed to be spent, which line items, because I put the budget together that says I have $1,500 of program supplies for these particular purposes. I'm going to spend it on a credit card, and I know which category on my budget that I'm going to attribute that to because I built those assumptions, right? So those are the sort of things that we're referring to here. And then last, schedule monthly reviews, even if it's just 30 minutes. Check-ins with your CFO and your department heads, whoever that might be, maybe even the CEO is involved, but have a regular meeting cadence to not only review the organizational health as a whole and where you're at with the budget, but also with each individual person to make sure that they're feeling comfortable and confident with the numbers that are happening. Okay, so just kind of summarizing this again, but if this all works according to plan, then we would hope that these things would be true. Department leaders now participate in the process. Staff now understand why they're spending the dollars, as I mentioned. Monthly reports are now a feedback loop, so they're truly a communication tool for the organization. There's regular reviews. The department leaders are asking, what's changed? Why? What's going on? What is this expense? I really love when people catch even the smallest like transactions. Like this $10 does not belong on my budget, right? Because every dollar matters to them. And then last but not least, your CFO can then take an updated forecast and change the assumptions on where we think we're heading for the organization. And we have a pretty clear picture. Hey, we're on track or we're off track. And if we're off this month, what is the compounding impact going forward? So that's kind of what accountability looks like there. All right, so I promise you the technology. What do we do in order to get more people involved? So we use two different tech stacks. We use Bill for vendor payments that are typically paid by check. Think about accounts payable, okay? We use Bill for that. Essentially, a team member will get a copy of an invoice, usually digitally these days, but sometimes in paper still, and they will submit it to an email. And they will already know, hey, this is for the trivia night, and it's going to be categorized to, I don't know, the venue or something, whatever the line items are in their particular budget. Could just be event expense, depending on how the organizational budget is set up. And so when they submit that, they actually categorize the vendor invoice. Like they will go in and say, hey, goes to event venue expense or something to that effect. They will submit that information with their invoice. Okay. And then when we get the invoice, we review it. We're like, yep, that seems reasonable. We're going to route it for formal approval after we've categorized it according to their specification. And then it gets approved by the person that initiated, and then whoever the second person is, typically executive director, CEO, whoever it might be. So now what this looks like is when AP goes out, we've already got the categorization by the team member that's responsible for that particular vendor invoice, whatever it might be. We've categorized it to align with the budget that they're expecting and the organizational budget, because we're all in sync now. We might also at the same time be tagging it to any particular grant, because it's not just by categorization of account, but sometimes it's a categorization of grant. So we can tag those things at the guidance of the person incurring the expense. And then when it finally gets to CEO, we, as their fractional CFO, have already signed off on all of these things. The person that initiated the expenses already know this is coming through. The CEO is like, great, if all these people have reviewed it, this looks also reasonable to me. I'm going to approve it. So at that time, then it automatically gets input into QuickBooks and synchronized. So at the end of the month, when we do all the reconciliations and we run the reports and we said, hey, program director, here are all of your expenses for the month. This is your budget to actual report. They would then be able to see that very same bill that they submitted with the appropriate categorization. They're like, yep, there's that $1,500 invoice that I sent in. That belongs there. Oh, by the way, what's this $50 invoice that I never submitted? I don't know how that ended up on my budget, but I'm going to let the charity CFO know that that doesn't belong there. And then we would make the appropriate adjustments. So that's what we do for bill, for vendor payments, for accounts payable. Let's talk about bill, spend, and expense, formerly known as Divvy. Divvy is an expense management platform. Essentially, I'm kind of oversimplifying. That is essentially a corporate credit card with a built-in expense management system. It's kind of set up very similar, but think about bill as vendor payments that need to be paid still, and bill, spend, and expense, formerly known as Divvy. I will always call it Divvy. We'll just call it Divvy for purposes of this. Bit of a mouthful. Divvy is more of a credit card, so submitting receipts for transactions that have already been paid. So with Divvy, you can set up staff level budgets for various things that you want to track. Maybe it's summer camp supplies. Maybe it's, volunteer appreciation. If you have somebody that's in charge of that, taking volunteers to coffee or whatever it might be. And then when the staff member, again, they put their budget together, I'm going to spend $500 on coffee dates with volunteers. When they go to, Park Avenue Coffee and they purchase their coffee, they submit that receipt through Divvy and they were able to tag it to that appropriate budget line item, volunteer appreciation or something to that effect, right? So then again, same thing. At the end of the month, they've categorized it already. They get a report, all the details, they look at it and they're like, hey, why Is there this on there? Or, oh, yep, that's the Park Avenue coffee receipt that belongs there. So it takes a little bit of time, but you can see why, if they're not involved in the budgeting process, it's going to be really hard for them to remember all the accounts, the categories for which they need to tag these expenses to. And if they're not involved in the budget process, they're not involved in the categorization of those expenses and uploading those receipts and understanding the line items for which they're allowed to spend from. And then the reports they're going to get to share the financial performance of their department, it's not going to be overly useful, or it doesn't totally make sense because they don't understand the assumptions that went into the original budget. All of these things are very interrelated. And just know that both bill and bill spend and expense, formerly known as Divvy, you can create micro budgets for individual staff, customize in any which way you want that aligns with your department budget, your organizational budget, cross departments, and it could be just very, very specific, like maybe for grants. You can create it, customize any way you want. Approval processes can be baked into both vendor payments, AP, and the credit card transactions. It makes it super easy to track receipts for people to upload their documentation, because I don't know about you all, but the credit cards, when I was a CFO of a nonprofit, was the worst part of my job. Nobody uploaded the receipts. We'd have like 3 credit cards for 80 people. Nobody knew who charged the what. So I personally use Divvy at the Charity CFO for all of my team. So I have 65 employees. Every single person on my staff has a Divvy card because we have a home office allowance. Everybody gets a $250 budget every single year. They charge that card and upload the receipt every time they buy home office expenses, so that we know whoever made that charge, we know exactly who the person is that didn't upload the receipt. And they have full visibility into what charges hit their credit card. So they know they need to upload those receipts, and they know which line items they're able to spend from. So that's worked out really, really well for us. I get no paid. So I get no paid relationship with any of these people. These are just platforms that I use. Kessel said, is there a slide for Divvy? So Divvy is the same as bill, spend, and expense. It's the same thing. This is actually Divvy we're talking about here. So this is a slide for Divvy. Bill acquired Divvy, and they've rebranded to bill, spend, and expense. So if you just go to bill.com, you'll be able to find it. It's very confusing. They could have probably come up with a different name than bill, spend, and expense, but they're all interrelated. It's one platform now, but it makes it really easy. And last thing I'll leave you with, and then I'll open up for a few questions. Bill does have a fee that you have to pay for the platform to pay vendor payments, and then you have a per transaction fee to pay vendor payments, like via check, if you will. Divvy / bill, spend, and expense, that is a free credit card that your organization will not only have the card for each employee, and I strongly encourage you to do it for each employee, and the expense management system, it's all free. It's all completely free. I think they make their money off the processing fees, if I'm being totally honest with you. So they make the platform free for any company. It's even free for me as not a nonprofit. And regardless of how many cards you have or what your transaction volume is, it doesn't matter. It's all free. And you do have to fill out a credit application, but it's on an organizational level, not a personal credit card. So many of us in the nonprofit world, we get our personal credit pulled. We have to do personal guarantees as an executive director. It is not that situation. So check it out if you haven't already. It's going to really be the icing on the cake. It's really going to bring it all full circle. So get them involved in the budget process, get them categorizing their own expenses in line with the budget line items that they agreed to and that they put together, and then provide reports for that second set of review for them to understand, yeah, these are the things that's happening. So check all of that out, and that is how you get the team members involved, and it's not going to be easy. I'm going to open up for a few questions. Kim, if we have any questions, we can go ahead and dive into that.
All right, we have, oh, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, before we do, I'm going to leave this slide up. If you all want to check out that financial blueprint with the 30 principles for nonprofits, I'm going to leave this up just to talk. So you can go to our website and download that. It's totally free. Fire away, Kim.
Okay, first one, why have you chose bill.com versus Ramp? We reviewed both and found Ramp much superior and so cheap.
Yeah, so we started bill.com. So I've had this firm now for almost 10 years, and we started bill.com because it works really, really well at the time with all of the platforms that we use. It interacts with Dext, which we also use for receipt collection. I didn't talk about Dext today because I don't think most nonprofits need Dext if they're Dex is kind of a virtual inbox. So just scratch that. You don't even have to write that down. But it does integrate with Dex. It does integrate with QuickBooks really well. I would say it was the front leader at the time when we were looking for a paperless option. I have heard other organizations using Ramp. They seem to like Ramp. I'm in a situation now where we have over 200 clients that operate on these different platforms. So for me to start introducing different software requires me to now change all of my clients from one platform to the other. So we're continuously looking for other options. I have also heard great things about Ramp. So if you do not have a outsourced accounting firm that really wants you to use a particular platform just for simplicity, yeah, I think Ramp's a good option. I've heard really great things about them. Selfishly, I have over 200 clients and 65 employees that are well trained on Bill.com. So for me to change a platform on my tech stack is a pretty big overhaul. And at the time, it's really important for anybody listening on any technology you're thinking about, making sure that the platform that you choose is scalable and has all of the dimensions that you need. And by dimensions, I mean, does it allow for categorization of expenses by the account? Does it allow for categorization by class or location? Those are different dimensions in QuickBooks, assuming most of us is on a platform like that. Does it allow, in the QuickBooks world, we use the customer field for grant tracking. So does it allow for the categorization of that as well? So any dimensions that you need within your accounting system, we make sure that any of those platforms also allow the end user, so the employee charging the dollars, are they able to categorize by all of those dimensions? Because some of the platforms out there, they'll spend as expense management platforms, they might only give you the option to categorize the account. But for example, if you have a team member that buys supplies for administration, fundraising, program, they need to be able to differentiate between which function they're buying it for, example. I can't speak too much about Ramp and if it has all the dimensions that we need. But back when we were looking for something, Bill was the only one at the time that had all of those dimensions that integrated really nicely, and the approval process for all of the nonprofit, bill approval process. So it's a
All
very
right.
long answer to that, but that's kind of our idea.
Another one, do you have a template that correlates the program budget with that of measuring benchmarks and goals met?
No, but we are talking about in January. It's been on my list for months on how to build or to do a webinar on, we follow EOS, Entrepreneurial Operating Systems. You all can kind of Google Traction. But when I hear that question, I think about Traction and EOS and how do we create KPIs and other benchmarks to track accountability across all the different functions, and not in a punitive way. It's just kind of like, are we all aligned on the things that are important to us, and are we measuring the things that are important to us so that we can know when things are off track and we can make decisions accordingly. And I think it's slated for January that we are going to do a webinar specifically on that. But I don't have a template yet that I'm ready to share, but I will hopefully in January.
All right. Besides Excel, what other programs are helpful when creating a budget?
So yeah, we Excel or Google Sheets. I mean, we use that. We use Google Sheets. We're a Google firm. I use that, but I mean, I find the most useful is creating some sort of budget workbook, and then I just use the QuickBooks reports. So the historical reports, like what happened last year, general ledger detail out of QuickBooks or whatever your accounting system is, to kind of see by each account what's every single transaction under each account, so that I'm not missing something like a software renewal or something like that. And I look at it for all of last fiscal year and then year to date in this current fiscal year as I'm putting that budget together. So we don't have any fancy tools. I mean, I've demoed different cash flow forecasting tools and budgeting tools and things like that. I've demoed them, and I think most of the accountants in the room can appreciate this, but nothing really quite replaces a really well put together spreadsheet because it's just so customizable.
And can you repeat what someone asked, what is EOS? They didn't catch that.
It's called Entrepreneurial Operating System. So EOS, E is an Edward. Yeah.
And then last one on there, David earlier on just said he didn't ask his ED to join as I feel strongly I'm doing all of this well, but I love that you, as an outsider, is basically repeating word for word what I presented to my ED board. So I'm hoping that this is recorded, which it is, and therefore I can just send them the webinar as an example that my plans are actually what should be done as opposed to how it's been done before.
I say it all the time on our podcast that even if I don't give you answers to your burning questions, at least I'll give validation. And it sounds like I've given David validation. We're almost out of time, so I'm going to flip through, Kim, a couple more slides.
Yep.
If you feel like you need more help in your organization, that you're getting too big, that you need a more robust budget, but you don't have that skills in-house, I'm happy to chat with anybody from the webinar. Go to our website, submit a contact form. We'll get in touch and we'll have conversation about that. So just know that the support is always there, and we're happy to do a 60-minute consultation just to kind of take a deeper dive into your organization. And then last but not least, as I promised, we're going to take this conversation of the budget and we're going to take it up a notch with those projections or the forecast that I was telling you about. So we're going to be doing that next month. November 19th at 2 p.m. Central Time. We'll send out some email reminders and you all can go ahead and register for that. You can go to our website on that, or Kim has also dropped a link for registration there. And again, this webinar will be available online probably, I don't know, within a few days or a week, the recording. For any of you that want to share this recording with someone else, thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you next time.